Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm Clay Green, and today I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Storey. Benjamin Storey is a senior fellow in social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. He has held academic posts at UT Austin, Furman, Princeton, and Chicago. There's so many that I didn't feel like listing out all the details. It's an impressive CV. His work focuses on political philosophy, liberal education, and American civil society. He is the co-author with his wife of Why Are We Restless? On the Modern Quest for Contentment. Very interesting title, something we'll return to in a minute. The two are also working on a new book called The Art of Choosing, How Liberal Education Should Prepare You for Life. Thank you for being here, Ben. I really appreciate you donating your time to the podcast.
Clay, thanks so much for having me on. And you didn't tell me there wasn't going to be an honorarium. I'm donating. Wait, no. that's just fine. Glad to be here.
It's a cup of coffee.
Okay,
but
great.
you gotta go get it yourself.
Okay.
We'll reimburse you though.
Wonderful. Thanks. Seriously, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to be talking with you, and particularly excited to be doing something with the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida.
Well, I'm curious. Your book title is very intriguing. Why are we restless?
So we wrote Why We Were Restless because of the first impetus for it was something that we were noticing among our students, which is that very high-flying students who had done everything that the university had asked of them, and then some, the kinds of kids who had, perfect GPAs in not just one major, but two or even three, who had founded one club and they were the treasurer of another, and they didn't just go on one study abroad program, they went on several, and they did summer internships and work study programs and so on and so forth. They did everything that our college and university system encourages them to do. These students would predictably, it got to be a pattern over the course of our teaching careers that we noticed that when they got to be getting toward the end of their college career, this particularly around the fall of their senior year, you would have these conversations with them in which they would describe their efforts to try to figure out what to do next. And their educations had left them, if anything, more confused than they were when they started out of their about what they ought to do with their lives. And so the one way that we came up with for describing what we were seeing in our students is that they were full of activity, they were full of motion, but they didn't seem to be going anywhere in particular. They didn't seem to have what you might call direction or genuine purpose. And so we started thinking about this as restlessness, and restlessness is a word that we had been thinking about because of some of the material we taught and studied, which is this great French tradition of moral and political philosophy called the tradition of the moraliste, that begins with Michel de Montaigne, and we trace it all the way up through Alexis de Tocqueville. And all of these thinkers were really interested in the question of restlessness, of why human souls are so disquiet, so unsettled with our social, political, and perhaps even natural or theological condition. And so there are different dimensions of this restlessness that we could tease apart. The two that I'll mention just to get us started are, on the one hand, there is the kind of restlessness that you might observe in a figure like St. Augustine. Augustine famously opens his Confessions by saying, "Our hearts are restless.
Rest in you." Yeah,
that's right. And so there's something of this that has I think you can see something very similar in the Hebrew Bible, in the stories of the nascent Israelite people wandering around in the desert looking for their home. I think you could see it in Platonic philosophy, and someone like Socrates describing philosophy as an erotic activity, an activity of longing that ultimately doesn't find any satisfaction in the world of flesh and blood as we know it, but has to be satisfied on the plane of something like ideas that we can never fully grasp as long as we are in our current condition. And so in this sense, you could say that there's a natural, timeless dimension of restlessness restlessness that is always with us.
Mm.
But then you could say there's another kind of restlessness. And I think this is the more specifically modern kind of restlessness. And this is a restlessness that comes with a kind of distinctly modern effort to make us more at home in the world than we've ever been before. It turns out in our view that the effort to make us more at home in the world than we've ever been before doesn't actually work. That is that we try to make ourselves at home in the world, and we find that that part of us that resonates with the words of St. Augustine about our hearts being restless until they rest in God, that part remains active, and we don't quite know what to do with it when our sights are trained on the kind of modern aspirations that so many of us are accustomed to longing for, the aspiration to advance one's station in life, the aspiration to live this worldly life to the fullest. That aspiration, there's something shocking when one discovers that even if you succeed wildly in the aspiration to improve one's condition, one's place in the world, one's place in the pecking order of American life, doesn't actually speak to that deeper longing of the human heart. So that's what we were really interested in that book.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And there are a number of things I'd like to follow up on. So you mentioned that there's this, in the second condition of restlessness, students especially, but really all of us, I hear my own concerns in this, are throwing themselves into a material, professional quest for what, putting it together with what you previously said, might be a kind of existential or spiritual problem. So how do those two things come into alignment? Because I assume that you think that student or all of our professional ambitions do have some connection to questions of final ends, purposes, something higher and more spiritual. Is there a way of bringing these two kinds of restlessness together and finding some kind of answer to, obviously, I can't ask you to give the meaning of life, but is there a way to help students see connections between what we could think of as these spiritual longings and their own purpose? Because clearly just rising up, making more money, that sort of thing is not cutting it.
Yeah, I like your way of putting that question, Clay, that, this search for a kind of conjunction between these two things. I think in order to get at what you're asking about, I need to take a step back and talk about why we disjoined these things, that is, our material strivings and our more spiritual longings in the first place. And so the story that we tell in Why We Are Restless begins in the wars of religion that took place in 16th century France. So we begin with a figure named Michel de Montaigne, who's a wonderful philosopher and essayist of that particular moment. And so Montaigne endured religious war as the basic political condition of France over the course of the last 30 years of his life. And so his contemporaries, his French fellow his fellow subjects of the French monarchy were roasting each other alive, that's his language, over very fine theological distinctions. That is, as he puts it in one particular place, it's all about the meaning of the Latin syllable hoc, as in this is my body. Which in a Catholic mass, the priest says every time he elevates the host at the moment of the transubstantiation of the Eucharist, as Catholic theology sees it. So this, just this word, this was a thing that people were willing to do really terrible things to each other about. And so Montaigne says, why is this? Why are we so caught up in this? And his way of dealing with the problem is to do this wonderful kind of comic philosophic history that he engages in. And so he says, look, philosophers have been arguing for centuries about the meaning of life, about the question of the summum bonum, or the highest good. And they've come up with, in fact, 288 different answers to that particular question. And nobody has ever generated anything like consensus, and they just keep arguing with each other. And there's a great deal of vanity and ludicrousness involved. And so Montaigne makes this argument explicitly about philosophers, but I think he pretty clearly means it to apply just as much to theologians, other kinds of religious authorities. And he says, like, you guys are always arguing about the deepest meaning of things, and it doesn't seem to produce anything other than vanity and quarreling and even war.
Mm.
And so Montaigne says, look, nobody's ever come up with a satisfying answer to these questions that really meets the needs of all people, that everybody finds equally compelling. And because that's the case, why don't we just stop asking the question?
Mm.
Why don't we just stop worrying about the question of the ultimate meaning of life? Instead of thinking about the question of the highest good, let's just enjoy a little bit of all the various good things that human beings are interested in. And so Montaigne keeps going to mass. He doesn't, just step completely away from his religion. He also keeps reading philosophy, including the philosophy of people who are profoundly opposed to his religion. He travels, but he does so with a kind of touristic spirit, as opposed to the kind of spirit that would animate somebody like a pilgrim, or much less a sort of conquistador or something like this. He investigates books. He loves books, but he doesn't pride himself on great philosophic discoveries or something like that. He dabbles. He's a very self-conscious dabbler. He does a little bit of this and he does a little bit of that. And so by stepping away from the question of our highest spiritual aspirations, Montaigne thinks he can put together a more humane kind of life that is rich and satisfying, but not single-minded. Because single-mindedness, I think, on his telling, is the deepest root of all of our human problems. And so that Montaignean vision leads us to separate it leads us to think that asking the question of the highest good, asking the question of the spiritual meaning of our pursuits, is a dangerous question. And it is a dangerous question. And so we frequently think that therefore it's just a question that's better not asked. But this is the thing, and this is what the next author that we deal with in Why We Are Restless points out. Look, you can try to sort of expel that question, the question of the highest purpose of human life. You can try to, sort of push that out the door. But if you do, it comes back through the window. It's not the kind of thing that a human being can avoid wondering about, because here we are, you and I, we've been thrust into the world. We find ourselves in a certain time and place. We know that we're going to die, and we want to know what the heck we're doing here and what we should make out of the finite time that we have. That question comes up unavoidably for human beings. Surely we need to learn to live with it more peaceably than people did in Montaigne's world. But nonetheless, we can't avoid asking it. And so I think the key to what you're describing of rejoining our spiritual aspirations and our efforts in the material world is to try to start asking that question seriously again, with the help of the kinds of books that we think about in Why We Are Restless, and many other books that you might find on the good curriculum of a great liberal arts program, for example.
Thank you. I'm teaching right now Goethe's Faust. Better image of modern restlessness you probably won't find. One of the things that frustrates me sometimes with my students is how hard it is to get them to consider the possibility that some situation might be better or worse than another. So common is the sort of relativistic, or the movement to simple relativism in argument. Do you think that relativism among young people is a contribution to their restlessness?
Clay, I'm sure you've heard this argument before when we describe the project that we're doing in Why We Are Restless. We describe the thought of someone like Michel de Montaigne, who's like the most charming and sophisticated relativist who has ever stridden the surface of the planet. People often will say to us, students are not relativistic these days. That's a memory of Alan Bloom in the 1980s and 1990s. And there's certainly something to that, in the sense that one sees a lot of moral stridency on campus these days in a way that one didn't I think a few decades ago. But I think you are correct to describe what you're seeing in the classroom, which is that the moral assertiveness that one finds among today's students, it seems to me, to rest on it's a kind of surface coating over a
Mm,
deep well of not just relativism but really nihilism. That
mm,
is, and in this I really feel for
mm,
today's students. I think they do not think that there's any purpose in
mm,
asking the kinds of questions that you seem to be trying to put in front of them, because they don't think
mm,
there's any possibility of making progress with
mm,
these kinds of questions. And they are in a kind of despair over the question of the meaning of life.
mm,
That despair is very frightening,
mm,
and it often stimulates the kind of a response of anger and moral passion,
mm,
which people latch onto, I think, in some ways as a way of finding solidarity, belonging,
mm,
perhaps, as Pascal would put it, distraction from the unanswerable moral questions that they often feel themselves to be facing.
mm. That issue of passion, I think, is incredibly striking. I mean, once we say that uh, either whether it's an authoritative thinker, authoritative text, a tradition, something like this, is not going to be the source of the good, what is the rule for us, there has to be something, and it either can be reason, perhaps something derived from reason, simply what's rational or what is most reasonable, or perhaps it could be the self. But if we look in the self, what's there? I mean, it's either one, empty, or two, it's just a bunch of passions. It's just a bunch of desires that go in all kinds of contradictory directions.
Yeah, my wife and I did a lecture a little while ago at the University of Notre Dame, in which we discussed the two sources of guidance that are most
Mm.
commonly put in front of students these days, which
Yeah.
are on the one hand the checklist, and on the other hand the inner voice.
Mm.
So since you asked about, I'm happy to talk about the checklist side of this if you're interested, but
Yeah, no, very
just
much so.
I'll just spend a minute first on the inner voice, because that's where you were headed.
Yeah.
I was often told in the course of my education, I would come to authorities, be like, what should I, I had no idea what to do with myself. I was a confused kid. I said, I'd ask people like, what should I do? What sort of life does it make sense to live? And they
Mm.
would tell me, oh, that's a question only you can answer for yourself. And you should have a kind of internal guidance system. You should have an inner voice that sort of summons you like a divine command
Mm.
to live this or that kind of life. It tells
Mm.
you exactly that it wants you to be an investment banker or a consultant or a college professor or whatever it is. And I think the people who told me these things were in a certain sense well-meaning. They meant to show respect for my individuality and freedom. But
Mm.
this way of throwing me back on myself really just left me more and more at a loss, because I would listen for the inner voice and I would find that it just wasn't there. My inner self just did not have anything to say.
Mm.
It was I had, as you say, I had passions, I had desires, I had all these kinds of things that people normally had, but none of them seemed to me to have authority. None of them seemed to me to be legitimate as a way of thinking about what to do with my life. And so for that, I had to learn to reason about these
Mm.
kinds of questions. And that was not something that I found readily available in the course of my own high school and the early parts of my college education.
Mm. Well, you've already begun to talk a little bit. I might, if we have time, come back to the checklist.
Sure.
But I am curious to hear a little bit more about your educational background. Just looking at your research, you have the absolute perfect research agenda for this podcast. It just couldn't be more appropriate. How did you come by that? You are a graduate of the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, which has it's a degree granting institution that has prestigious previous members, including Alan Bloom, who you mentioned, who talked about that kind of how relativism leads to a kind of how does the phrase go? Oh, too much openness leads to closedness, something
Hmm.
like this, and the kind of uh, thinking about the kind of questions that you're obviously working on, you and your wife together are working on today. Um, what was your educational journey like, and where do you think were the key moments in your education?
Um, so I was I came into college at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Um, and I hadn't been much of a high school student. And I was able to go to a good college, I think, because I was a good trombone player. And and I sort of woke up to the
Mm,
charms of academic life
mm,
from the moment I set foot on that beautiful and inspiring campus. There were all these serious people around, and they held out in front of me the standard of living a life by high intellectual aspirations, and I was really moved
mm,
by that, really from day one. Interestingly, the first teachers I really came to admire were like a statistician, a physicist. I didn't have the aptitude or the
mm,
interest in going on in physics or statistics, but I just thought these were really serious people,
mm. Good
and I wanted
teachers are good teachers.
that's exactly right. And I just wanted to be like them. But for the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask, the questions of human nature and human purpose that we've been talking about some
Mm,
already today, I was looking around without finding a lot of guidance for a long time on that campus in various corners. And then I came across this remarkable class. It was called The Elements of Politics, and it was taught by two professors, one named Ann Hall, who was a tenured professor in the English department, and the other named Larry Goldberg.
mm,
And Larry Goldberg was an adjunct. And those of you who are involved in academic life know that an adjunct is the lowest rung on the totem pole of the academic ladder. But Larry Goldberg was the
I
greatest
think it's
teacher.
I think it's right there with postdoc. I
It's
think
a, it's it, 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 it's you know, yeah, it's not what you want. You know, but Larry and was the greatest teacher I had ever seen, and I've never seen a better one in all my years in the academic world. I've been in the academic world now for almost 30 years, and Larry was simply astonishing.
mm,
And his way of teaching was really simple. He assigned wonderful books, and he asked what I think could basically be summed up as two very basic kinds of questions. The first question was, we'd read a passage from some great book, and he would ask us, "What does that say?"
mm.
And let me give you the second. The second question that he would ask is, first he'd ask us, "What does it say?" The second he would ask us, "Is it true?" And so let me give you just one example of this, because it's a real turning point in my life. Um, it was about the second day of class, fall of my junior year, and we were reading Homer. We were reading the Iliad, and we were reading this famous speech that is given by Sarpedon, to another of the soldiers with whom he's fighting, about why they fight, why they stand out there on the front lines. And Sarpedon gives an account of why they do this, and it's a beautiful little poetic speech. And Dr. Goldberg said what he had us read the speech. Then he said what he usually said. This is as I recall it. He says, "What does this say?" And I said something like the following: "Well, the ancient Greeks had an honor culture, and
Mm.
this is a description of the ancient Greek honor culture." And Dr. Goldberg looked at me and said, "Well, yes, Mr. Storey, but do you think it's true?" And I was absolutely bowled over by this question, because it was the first time anybody had asked me what I thought about the potential meaningfulness of something like this from an ancient book. I mean, in other words, like, what was implied in Dr. Goldberg's question was, okay, maybe Sarpedon is part of an ancient Greek honor culture, but he's making an argument about how human beings ought to live. And that argument might be true, and that argument might be false.
Mm.
And the notion that this could be true or false. And moreover, the notion that it was that I should have an opinion about this, or that I should be trying to think it through. I should be trying to figure out how human beings ought to live. And I might be able to get some help with that from these old dead guys in greaves and helmets with big feathers on them and so on and so forth. The notion that this was possible, this was absolutely, totally, radically new to me. In the course of this particular conversation. And so my liberal education got started then. And Dr. Goldberg had been an undergraduate student at the University of Chicago. And one day we were talking, and he told me of the existence of this thing that you mentioned a minute ago called the Committee on Social Thought. And what the Committee on Social Thought, I think it'd be fair to say that what the Committee on Social Thought is, it's a liberal education at the graduate level. And it's one of the only degree granting PhD programs in the country that does that. I spent 7 wonderful years there. 7 years was not considered a long time. When I was a student there, but it was just a marvelous experience with great teachers like Leon Kass and Nathan Tarkov and Mark Fumaroli, who's a now sadly deceased great French professor who was a visitor there and was very important to me, and Ralph Lerner and Herman Soneiko and Robert Pippin and many other wonderful people on that faculty.
Wonderful. And I have to ask, do you consider yourself a Straussian?
No. On the one hand, I learned lots from the books of Leo Strauss.
Yeah.
I learned lots from the students of Leo Strauss. But I eventually came to find in Straussianism a kind of, 10-cent magic decoder ring way of reading all the books that I really loved. It was like, like if you'll forgive a little bit of caricaturing of what Straussianism sometimes turns out like.
Yeah, just say you're describing Greg McBrayer.
I'm not describing Greg McBrayer. I am just describing a certain version of late night conversations that sometimes happen among my graduate school friends. Look, there's always a secret teaching, and the secret teaching is always the same. The secret teaching is always that there is no God.
They're always atheists. Yeah, exactly. They're always atheists.
Well,
John Locke's really an atheist. Thomas Hobbes is really an atheist.
That's right. They're all really, really atheists. And this is the thing. I was raised an atheist. And so this was, and it's like the ordinary way of thinking of a 1980s American kid.
Yeah.
And so there was zero reason to find this exciting. So I didn't find it exciting, and moreover, I didn't think it was true when I got down to what I just kept, reading books like Plato. Well, if Plato's an atheist, why does he talk about God all the time? And this is just confusing to me. And so, look, I learned lots from Leo Strauss and the students of Leo Strauss about reading slowly and patiently and in a very careful way these old books and of taking them and Straussianism helped me get over the assumption that what was newer was necessarily truer than that which was older. And so for this, I'm permanently grateful. But what I found is that it's much more interesting to try to read an author like Montaigne in a Montaignian way, an author like Pascal in a Pascalian way, an author like Plato in a Platonic way, than it is to try to read all of them in terms of the sort of big arguments, the philosopher in the city that are the center of Strauss's work. That's no disrespect to Strauss's work. Strauss discovered a really interesting question there. I just don't know that question should be applied to book after book after book in a way that ends up homogenizing them all.
Yeah, I take that. I think you're very much right. When you discover Strauss, especially if, like me, you're coming from something like literary criticism where relativism is just assumed, the pseudo-Platonism of Strauss, whatever is the right way of describing that kind of continual possibility that there might be a better rather than a worse, that he takes very seriously. It was a revelation for me. Combination of Closing of the American Mind and Natural Right and History were Yeah, it was like discovering a new continent, something like this.
Yeah, no, these books, and I think these books have this power, but I think it's also important to recognize that this is not a phenomena exclusive to somebody like Strauss. So it might be good for your listeners to be aware of, for example, the French philosopher Pierre Hadot. The
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, wonderful.
Yeah, and Hadot made his own way by a very different path than
Yes.
Leo Strauss to the same central contention, I think, which is that philosophy is a way of life, and it's a way of life that can be taken seriously now as it was taken seriously in antiquity. And in this, and I think what he's discovering, which Strauss also discovered, is that philosophy is a kind of perennial human possibility, and
Right.
I think that's a true and valid discovery that one can learn from Leo Strauss, but doesn't need to learn there. There's lots of other people who've come by this proposition all across time.
Hadot's uh, recently published in English book on Goethe is good. I would highly recommend it.
Great. I think, and my wife has looked at it some. I have not.
Okay,
But
it's good.
I will take your recommendation.
It's very good. Hadot's wonderful. So we've talked some about why we are restless, and we're sort of moving into um, uh, the broader question of liberal education, or maybe not the broader question, but the adjacent question of liberal education. Mm-hmm. What is your definition of liberal education, and what would you, for the sake of making a distinction, what isn't liberal education?
So my own view of liberal education changed a lot over the course of my teaching career. So I was at Furman University for 17 years, and I still do a lot of teaching now from here at AEI. And what I saw over the course of those 17 years was that the approach to liberal education that I had started with didn't really speak to the needs of my students in the same way that I thought it should. And so that led me to adjust my practice over the course of those years. And so, give you a concrete sense of what I mean. The way that I learned liberal education from some of my own great teachers was they presented us with a series of alternatives. That is, you read Plato on one day, and you read Thomas Aquinas the next, and Machiavelli the day after that, and so on and so forth. And each of these alternatives, and many of my own great teachers, they did something that I have a lot of respect for, which is that they were just the lawyer for the book that was on the table.
Yeah.
And that was, there was a kind of professional dignity in this. It was just kind of like, I'm only going to put in front of you things that I think are really worthwhile. And I'm going to argue for whatever book is in front of you. And I am not going to tell you what I think. That is not the subject of this course. The subject of this course is the history of thinkers. It's not me. And that's great. And I think, and there's something very powerful about that. And I think it has a place in liberal education rightly understood. The thing about it is that what it tends to do is suggest there are a variety of equally compelling answer to the fundamental human questions. And I think for a lot of students, what that ends up meaning is, look, Nietzsche's a genius and Aristotle's a genius, and they don't agree. And I am just some half-educated American kid. I cannot figure out these great Greek and German quarrels, and so, as far as I'm concerned, you might as well just be a relativist. Because if the geniuses can't agree, who am I to try to come up with anything that I think is actually true? And I think that view of what's really going on in our tradition is not the whole truth of what's there, and really could use to be rethought. I think when, so for example, Socrates himself is often presented as a model of kind of perpetual open-mindedness. He's ready for any question. He's not afraid to investigate anything. And in a certain sense, all of that is true. But if you look at Socrates and the way that Socrates lives, he clearly has arrived at what you might think of as points of moral certainty.
Mhm.
That is, he'll argue with you all day long about whether power or money, for example, is the human good. But doesn't seem in his person, as we watch him, how he lives his life, he doesn't seem remotely tempted to go into money making or political office seeking just to see for sure if those things might actually be satisfying. I think he has answered the question of the good life sufficiently to his purposes to actually eliminate some of the things that are very attractive to human beings as possible highest purposes of human life. He's given himself some moral orientation. What I came to see more and more in my students over the course of the years is that they came into the classroom extremely confused from day one. These were not people who were walking into the classroom with a lot of overly settled moral certainties that needed to be shaken up by the idol smashing Socratic pedagogue. They were my students were deeply troubled and perplexed about which end was up in the moral universe, and they really wanted help figuring that out. And it turns out that this tradition that we inherited actually has some things to say about the question of how you want to live your life that don't all amount to, well, it's a very big and untidy question. And so that was so my own sense of liberal education developed from simply raising questions that nobody really has the answer to, which I think is, again, I think those questions are wonderful and serious and so on and so forth, to trying to figure out what a liberal education might offer to each individual reader, each individual student, in terms of actually helping them make the decisions that are going to define the purpose of their lives, because we have to make those decisions. We could just, if we were gods, we could just sit up there on Mount Olympus and wonder whether Plato or Nietzsche was right for all of eternity. But we're not gods. We have to make decisions, and I think I think most people who are in the teaching business have actually made those decisions in their own lives. And I think our students deserve to hear from us just why we've concluded, for example, that maybe teaching is a worthwhile thing to do with one's life. What is it in our own reflections on human existence that have led us to think that that might be a worthy way of life? I think we need to concentrate on liberal education understood as a kind of governing of oneself, more than we have in the past.
This begs the question for me: by the time we get students in college, is it too late? If so much of moral formation has to,
Yeah.
so much of these higher questions have to be built upon a larger history of character formation, is it too late? I know you well know that Aristotle says that in order, prior to anything we would call philosophy, there needs to be all this work of character formation. And I think this is common sense for a lot of people, right? You have your kids watch moral tales, right? You don't let them watch things where the bad guys win or people just do whatever they want and are rewarded. There's this whole massive machinery, everything cultural, religious, everything else, contributing to inculcating, not always through rationality, through the training of sentiments and things like this, that goes into making up someone's character. So do you think that well, I could just leave the question at, do you think it's too late by the time you're picking up a book, a book called The Art of Choosing, or is it possible to have that kind of moral education throughout one's life?
Well, this is a tremendous problem. I was thinking exactly the passage in Aristotle that you referred to here, which I read for the first time as a graduate student, and I was seriously distressed by this passage, because I was like, I don't think I got the kind of habituation that Aristotle is thinking about here. And so I want to try to answer your question in two parts. The first, with respect to earlier moral formation. I am deeply impressed by and involved in, as a parent, the movement for classical schools in the United States. My three children all attend classical schools.
Oh, wonderful!
And I am just astonished by what these things do for my children, and how much further along they are
Mm.
than I was at their ages. And so it is possible to find schools in contemporary America that attend really thoughtfully to the formation of the moral imagination, that pay attention to the songs kids are singing, to
Mm.
the images that they're seeing, to the habits that they're cultivating over the course of the day, even to that even make gym class into a morally formative part of education. That really goes on
Mm.
at my daughter's high school, and so I'm just delighted to see these things happening in the world, and I think that's a tremendous advantage for children who are fortunate enough to attend these kinds of institutions. And it's great for parents to know that they're out there. And if you're a parent and you're interested in this kind of thing, take a look. These things are being founded all the time. In some cases by parents who just get dissatisfied with the options that are available to them and start their own. That was the case with our children's wonderful school in Greenville, South Carolina, called Veritas Preparatory Academy, with which they attended before we moved up here to DC. So on the one hand, yes, it's great to have moral and educational and familial institutions that attend to this kind of moral formation when kids are much younger. But secondly, with respect to what happens if you're like me and you just come across Aristotle when you're a college student, or in my case, a graduate student, and then you have to deal with it. Well, look, that's the struggle that I think most of us live with in human life, is that we come to adulthood and we find that we have not been perfectly habituated. It turns out that original sin applies to us, which is kind of shocking. But there it is, and you can struggle, and sometimes you lose. But nonetheless, I think that struggle does often lead to a better life than one might otherwise have lived.
I think that there are a number of people, maybe they won't have made it this far into the podcast, but when they hear people saying the sorts of things we're saying, what they hear is, you're trying to constrain my freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You hate my freedom. How would you respond to that kind of complaint?
I would respond in the way that Plato does in the later books of the Republic, in which I think he describes the experience of being left to one's own devices, of having freedom in the sense of doing whatever one happens to want on the spur of the moment. And look, this is not an unfamiliar experience to me. With respect to the earlier how I lived in the earlier periods of my life. I think what one finds when one doesn't have a principle of order that allows one to sort of try to arrange one's life in a reasonable and even beautiful manner, what one finds is that one begins by thinking one is doing whatever one wants, and then one finds oneself a slave to all kinds of impulses and powers and worse than impulses and powers that dominate the soul when we don't govern it. The soul is one of the great lessons of Plato's Republic, is that the soul is more political than we might like to imagine, that it is internally political. It has different parts or elements or facets, and the arrangement of those parts is crucial to the flourishing of a human life. And if we're not willing to order ourselves and try to live by the light of reason and the love of the things that are most truly and enduringly beautiful, well, then we'll be ruled by other things. And the higher parts of so you can either let the higher parts of yourself rule over the lower, or you can let the lower parts of yourself rule over the higher, but you can't have nothing. There will be a kind of hierarchy in the soul. There will be dominant passions, and we have to pay attention to what those dominant passions will be.
There's a wonderful quote by Viktor Frankl that I'll sort of paraphrase. That's something to the effect of, freedom is the ability to have a pause between impulse and response.
Yeah.
And that's where freedom is. And I think he's maybe thinking of Kantianism or something like this, but also just his own psychological studies and experiences. And it is very much true that if we simply do what we want, well, what's the wanter in this circumstance? Sometimes
Yeah.
it's just blind elements of ourselves that the maybe I'm loading the dice by saying higher, but I'll say it, the higher part of ourself wouldn't choose. And only what we choose, as it were, in defiance of, those kind of simple impulses is truly free.
Yeah, this is I love Viktor Frankl. I actually don't love the quotation that you read from him. And I mean, like, look, it's obviously partially true, right? That if we're not able to pause before acting on our desires, well, we're a slave to those desires. That's clear. But it's a remark that is almost exactly parallel to something in John Dewey. And while there's some admirable things about John Dewey, the on this, I think he's fundamentally wrong, because the question is like, okay, I have my impulses, and what I should be able to do is pause so as to sort of think through how I'm going to realize my impulses. And so what this does is it reduces reason to a kind of instrumental status, right? Reason is the slave of the passions, but it should be an intelligent slave of the passions, right? And that might sometimes involve slowing the passions down. There's another way of thinking about this, which is that you can be governed by your rational conception of things. In other words, you can think out, I'd like to live the following kind of life. And then you can think out, you can say, I think that would be a good kind of life. I think that would be fitting for a human being. And then you can strive toward that. You can act on a reasoned and imaginative vision of what you want your life to look like. And that is, and so in other words, and part of what your reason will show you, your reason has its own desires, right? It wants to know. And so you might imagine, like, look, I want to live a life that involves a lot of time spent in libraries because I love these places. And that's not just an impulse. That's my longing to know, the sketching out the concrete physical meaning of what it would mean to live a life that would satisfy it. And so in this sense, I think we don't just need to understand our freedom as the ability to restrain our impulses. We need to think that impulses are not all we are, that the rational part of ourselves might be the most truly us part of ourselves, that we might be our minds above all, and that satisfying them might be the core of the kind of life that we want to live.
I completely agree with everything you just said. And I think in my own mind, I had turned Viktor Frankl into a kind of Plato/Kant. So I appreciate the clarification, because I really do think that someone like Dewey has the kind of conception that you're talking about. That all of our impulses are part of the organism that we are. They're all good, so to speak. And, we don't need to, or it's not quite possible to make the kind of judgments that have that independent standpoint of reason in order to be able to make those judgments upon impulses.
Yeah, that's I think this is one of the sources of the whole Deweyan revolution in American education, in which I think took place because of some understandable desire for a more sort of democratic education than was available in the early part of the 20th century. And so, when you read John Dewey describing, for example, like what the traditional school was like in the 19th century, it was like, sages on stages, pounding Latin into their pupils with a literal stick.
Right.
This is, I don't want to go back to that. I think it's, I think that's, I love education by means of conversation. I think Dewey is in a way a step toward that, but folded into the whole Deweyan project is a really distorted conception, in my view, of what the human being is all about, that necessarily leaves people doing things like listening for inner voices that do not exist. And this is a really, and this is a great problem in American education. And it's one of the reasons that classical education is such a hopeful thing to me, because it recovers, some of the elements of the anthropological tradition, the teaching about what a human being is, that
Yeah.
were lost in the Deweyan educational revolution.
Mm. Yeah, I'm struck that so obviously, we've moved past schoolmasters with rulers, whipping you, but I do think that, and I'm curious to know if you agree, that any serious pursuit eventually, uh, especially if you're pursuing it on your own, you're going to have to hold the ruler over yourself. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there simply is no possibility that at every single stage you're going to be spontaneously, uh, you know, pleasurefully choosing this this pursuit. At many stages you're going to have some internal discipline. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think Aristotle distinguishes on the one hand between virtue and continence.
Hmm.
And virtue is wanting to do the right thing and doing it
Hmm.
consistently without internal struggle. Continence is, you kind of want to do the right thing and you kind of want to do the wrong thing, and you have a fight in your soul about it. And hopefully you do the right thing, but sometimes you don't. The and we should all be as virtuous as we can. We should all make it so that our longings are as aligned with a genuine and thoughtful conception of goodness as possible. But most of us are sometimes going to find that the best we can do is continence. And that means that the struggle in the soul that you're describing is going to have to take place. But I think this can be something, particularly when you're young, this can be something like the many sort of lessons of drudgery through which we rightfully put children, right? Like, you're going to have to, throw a baseball 1,000 times before you get to be tolerably good at throwing a baseball. Or you're going to have to sit down at the piano and play your scales again and again and again until you can actually play some Mozart. The and these
Memorize your multiplication tables, which
that's
if you don't do, good luck.
That's right. And so,
Yeah.
like, look, there's a lot of drudgery involved in education, but everybody who's been through one of those kinds of exercises knows that on the far side of it comes a kind of human activity that would be unavailable without it, and that constitutes some of the deepest satisfactions that we know. And so, if you've, for the parents out there, if you've ever, insisted that a kid, sit down with their violin and again and again and again, and you can't stand the sound of it because they can't possibly keep the thing in tune, and it's extremely painful. But one day they actually learn the thing and they do something marvelous on it. And it is the greatest thing in your life to witness, and it's the greatest thing in their life to do. I think that's a goal that educators always have to keep their eye on.
I want to start wrapping things down to respect your time, but I did want to return to this continence and virtue issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. The way that you described Aristotle's position on continence and virtue is close to the exact reverse of something C.S. Lewis says in Mere Christianity. He says something to the effect of, if you enjoy doing good, or if you do good because you have a good disposition, you get a certain amount of credit. I'm putting that in quotation marks. You get a certain amount of credit for making that choice, but the person who enjoys it less because of whatever their disposition is, they actually get more credit, because what matters is the effort itself. It's the difficulty of maintaining what he calls continence, or what Aristotle calls continence. I think Lewis doesn't have a specific term in the case, but that is actually kind of helpful for those of us who, didn't have an extremely rigorous moral education. But it's also helpful when talking to students or people who are somewhere along the path that they feel really discouraged, that they, as it were, they would so much rather eat the cheeseburger than the broccoli. Though obviously we're dealing with more serious matters. What do you think about that issue?
Yeah, I never want to put down anybody's moral struggles and the effort that they make to go through them, which is crucial to the turning points in lots and lots of our lives. And so, all honor to to that kind of struggle. At the same time, I think it might be helpful to people to think that, for example, you can say getting out of bed early in the morning. Maybe you find this absolutely exhausting at first. Well, look, you do it often enough, it becomes second nature,
Mm,
and you don't even think about it anymore. And that might be useful for people engaged in those struggles to know
mm,
that these struggles can sometimes have a happy ending. You're going to find other struggles on the other side of that, and there's still more to do. And so in that sense, the moral effort, as you're describing it in Lewis's terms, is always needed and valuable. But yeah, that you can habituate yourself to virtue is, I think, good news.
mm. Yeah, that's a great point. I think I'll start saying that to students who have trouble getting up in the morning. That in fact it does get easier.
Yeah.
So as we begin to wind down here, I want to ask you about just to generalize a little bit about the state of humanities education. You're a professor at Furman for 17 years, you said. Um, Different people will give you different perspectives. It's either really, really bad or it's only kind of bad. Maybe some people think it's great. I don't know. Where do you think we are in terms of the state of the humanities, the state of the liberal arts, and how possible is it to get this kind of education in American university today?
Well, I think it's very important to not despair, and I think there's good reasons for not despairing when one looks at the course of the history of humanistic study. People have struggled with this for a very long time. It's very rarely the case that everything is just perfectly supported and just and relatively without conflict. I think we also see real reasons for hope in terms of humanistic education, in terms of that what I've found is just remarkable interest outside of colleges and universities in the best that the humanities offers, from the classical schools we've been talking about intermittently over the course of this conversation to the every adult, every halfway educated adult I know is in, like, not just one, everybody's in one reading group and some are in five. People are really interested in reading good, serious books and getting a better education that way. And then within the world of higher education, yeah, there's a lot to lament. It really depresses me that so much of what passes for humanistic education is a kind of knee-jerk critical studies that has just forgotten that the whole fun of studying something like English literature is, in the first place, noticing that a poet like Milton writes beautiful, extraordinary things and explaining why they're beautiful. That is not a despicable kind of exercise. That's a noble and difficult kind of exercise. But there's lots of stuff out there that, if you're interested in excellent humanistic work going on at the college level, there are places to turn. The Hamilton Center at the University of Florida is one of the things that I identify as a place to turn, and there are lots of other such projects going on across the country.
What do you think civilians who are friends of liberal education can do to help encourage places like this or places like AEI?
Oh, I think they can support them. They can show up. They can investigate them when their children are looking at schools. They can continue the project of liberal education for themselves. This is not just something that is, like, I want this to go well in the universities, but I want it to go well in the universities because I think it's good for human life and I think it's good for our country. So in this sense, I just encourage people to keep the flame alive. It really matters. If you keep reading books and reading them with your friends and sharing them with your children, that is all really important civilizational work, and we should never lose. Whatever we think about these institutions, and I could talk about these institutions all day, we should never forget the fact that, like, Socrates didn't work for an institution, and neither did Boethius. Neither did Montaigne. The great humanists, none of them were college professors. And nonetheless, they made a decisive contribution to our civilization. And they remind us that the value of poetry is it's a beautiful and good poem that helps you and the people you love see human life more clearly and beautifully. And that is the thing that's why we treasure the humanities. We don't treasure the humanities because we want, tenure track jobs for our friends, although I want tenure track jobs for my friends. We treasure the humanities because the humanities are worth treasuring. And that's I think the fundamental thing I hope that all of us can remember.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you for your time, Ben. I really appreciate you agreeing to be on the podcast.
Okay, Clay, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.